Hey, Super Dave here. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Bleeding Edge Interviews. This time around, I'm going to be talking to a gentleman who is part of a band that is 8 years after their first album, just now delivering their second album. And yet somehow, the enthusiasm and momentum the band has doesn't seem to have diminished much in 8 years. And this would be Jamie Van Dyck of the band Earthside. Their brand of, whether you want to call it progressive, cinematic, post-metal / rock, whatever, is exceedingly unique and has really captured the imagination of a lot of people, and a lot of folks are very excited about it. Matter of fact, these guys are able to, even with the first album, pull up a slew of heavy-hitting guest vocalists and guest performers. So you know something special is going on when people are able to do that kind of thing right out of the gate. So without further ado, let's get into my conversation with Jamie Van Dyck of Earthside about their latest album, Let the Truth Speak. Well, nice to meet you, Jamie. I really thank you for joining me this evening. I'm glad we were able to make this work out.
Yes, me too. I'm glad to be here, Dave.
So I guess I'm going to start off kind of with the obvious. It's been a minute since the last Earthside album. It's 8 years at this point in time, right? And what have you guys been up to all that time?
I was going to say more like 2, but if it's been 8, so be it. Well, I think when people hear this album, not that it justifies necessarily an 8-year absence, but I think people will hear why this isn't your typical 2 to 3 year record, as far as, all that went into creating it and all the collaborations there were to manage, how layered of a record it is, and just how many sort of compositional decisions there were to make. This was a pretty significant undertaking. I think that, in combination with some of our own mental health kind of limitations, I think some of our personal weaknesses kind of really reared their head in making this record, as far as whether it be perfectionism or sort of paralysis of indecision, and really agonizing over micro nuances that other people might not even pick up on. Yeah. So, and then there were things along the way, like, for the first week of recording guitars and I fracture my wrist, so then we have to pivot and do something else. I didn't fracture my wrist playing guitar. I fractured my wrist doing something else. But, things like that. I think the pandemic, while I'm sure affected everybody, it affected our record from a collaborative standpoint, as far as we had certain vocalists who had, including a couple fairly significant names, who had said they were good to do it and wanted to be on the record and were paired with a song, and then the pandemic hit and they had to move, or they had their own mental health things come up, and just so I think we had 3 different vocalists paired with 2 or 3 different songs at the outside of the pandemic, all of whom then had to renege on that. Mm-hmm. So, maybe they're potential vocalists for future records, but it meant, and you see the number of collaborators we have on this record, clearly we had a lot of spots to fill. So now, in some cases, it wasn't necessarily the case that we initially were going to have multiple vocalists or multiple guests on the specific track, but it turned that way. I think a big pivotal moment was in, I think it was August of 2020, right after all 3 of these vocalists in the previous 3 to 4 months had backed out. It was a very daunting time to feel like, man, we have this record mostly instrumentally done, but unlike with A Dream in Static, we only had 4 songs with guest vocals. This one, well over half the record we envisioned having vocals. And with that, came, and we're very picky when it comes to not just the quality of the vocalist, but how well they fit the emotion we're looking to evoke with the song and how their voice pairs with the vocal we've written as far as the register, as far as the timbre of the voice. So anyway, in August of 2020, I made a Facebook post on my own Facebook under the name Jamie Earthside. And, one of the good things about being friends with a lot of progressive music fans is that my Facebook friends list is chock full of people who are obsessed with music and obsessed with music discovery. And so, in my post, I requested, hey, not like people in prog necessarily, not the obvious names, you don't need to tell me that Leprous exists. We know, believe it or not, we worked with their drummer and toured with them like twice. So when we have the right song to work with Einar, we know to reach out to him. So it's, asking for suggestions of vocalists that might not be on our radar. And from that post, we discovered a vocalist named Ketra Johnson. Looks like Ketura, but Ketra. We discovered a singer named Pritam Adhikari. We discovered Gennady Tkachenko-Papish, who's, on the song Let the Truth Speak that we released a few months ago.
Thank you for saying his name for me so I didn't have to, because I'm certain I would have messed it up.
Well, every single person who went to do the React video got it wrong. So I thought I'd even I think on our Instagram, I did it in a story. I did a tutorial on how to pronounce his name. And then I DM'd it to Gennady and I was like, how'd I do? And he was impressed. So I did pretty well for an American. So
nice.
I think I pronounced his name better than when he was on Britain's Got Talent, the people who had the hosts of the show who had prided themselves on learning to pronounce his name. They said his name and then he's like, yes, I got it. And I'm like, I think I actually pronounced his name 10 times better than you did. So you had a false declaration of victory, but I think mine is actually accurate. But and then AJ Channer of Fire from the Gods, we knew of Fire from the Gods, but with the post I made, a few people commented him as a recommendation, and it reminded us, that could actually be cool. Let's see if we can get in touch with him. So he wouldn't have been on our radar without that kind of nudge from people reminding us hey, what about him? So yeah, I mean, really ultimately, probably, half the songs on the album have a collaborator that came out of that Facebook post.
Wow.
So that was an important moment in being able to move the album forward at a time when it looked like, we were very discouraged by where we felt like we were at that point, when we just knew we were striking out with collaborators, either with them saying no or saying yes and then having to back out. We knew we had a lot of work on our hands to get from where we were at that point to where we wanted it to be.
Wow. And that you anticipated a couple of my questions right there in that one answer. That's impressive.
There's a lot to unpack in that one question, so it gets there.
Well, and I guess I imagine that somewhere in the midst of all that stuff, I can't imagine you guys didn't start to feel a bit snake bitten, and perhaps maybe want to, curse the gods or whatever in the midst of everything. Like that. That sounds like that must have been exceedingly frustrating dealing with all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I've said to our drummer Ben, within the first handful of months of setting out to do this record and realizing we had bit off way more than we thought. Because actually, when we started this record, we're like, we can just self-produce this record. It'll be faster. And then we very quickly were like, oh yeah, that is not true. we are not the people to do that with this record. This is more ambitious than our Dream and Static album, and on top of that, we are undermanned to take this on by ourselves. But yeah, as far as this is where I was going with that. So in 2018, I remember saying to Ben several months into making this record, I was like, Ben, and we'd been writing it for well over a year, a couple of years, and we were several months into recording it. And I said to Ben, we could just scrap this record and start a new record from scratch. And I promise you, we'd finish it faster than we'd finish this record. And I was almost pleading with Ben to like, can we just table this record? Like, this feels like a band's fifth album. It doesn't feel like a band's second album. Can we just like put this on the shelf for a little and like actually make a record that makes sense to make with our current means, and one that we could actually, yes, we'd be starting, from scratch more than, 2 years after Dream and Static's release. But, it feels like we're not even close to finishing this one. And given it, we are releasing this one, 5.5 years after I made that claim, and finished it about 5 years after I first said that. I do think I was probably right that we might have been better served professionally to table that record and try to create something that wasn't, I don't want to say as ambitious, but was ambitious in a way that we were more positioned to manage.
Right.
But I think we were so emotionally attached to certain things in this record that, one, we weren't going to let go of it, and then two, within the creation of the record, there were so many things we were attached to that, therefore, it was difficult to let go of individuals' decisions in making it.
Okay, so that sounds like what you guys described on the website as the idealistic ambition and absurd commitment driving you through all of that.
I think that's accurate. And attachment to exactly how we wanted it. As much as A Dream in Static was generally well received, there were things that for us they didn't sound exactly how we wanted them to. They didn't come out exactly how we had envisioned them coming out. So there was this feeling of close but no cigar that was kind of following us. And so with this record, it wasn't about making it more perfect from the standpoint of we felt like we had to live up to A Dream in Static from a fan perspective. It was more for ourselves. There were a few things we just didn't quite get how we wanted them. And we weren't going to be able to move on from this record unless we got those things the way we wanted them on this album. And the good news is, at least in taking 8 years to do it, we did that. So I think we got more the drum sound we wanted, that, sort of fit, that suited the song well. We got more, maybe like the heavier rhythm guitar sound we wanted in certain songs. That there were certain things that were like the sound of our dreams. We finally got it on this record. So I think the other good news is that means now, after 8 years of this record's release, 8 years between releases, I think we're now better situated to set out to make our third record whenever that time comes. It's weird to be talking about making the third record when you're still a few days away from releasing the second, though. I guess when this airs, depending on the medium in which it airs, maybe it will have already been released at that point. But that I do think we'll be able to let go of some things we didn't let go of on this record, and that we can set out to make an album that is ambitious, but from a lifestyle standpoint is more within our day-to-day, what we can take on, and learning from this process to really be honest with ourselves before we set out to make our next record. Right. But yeah, I don't think we'll have that same feeling of, we didn't quite get that on this last record, so we got to chase it on this next one. I think the thing we're chasing on this next one is manageability when we go to do the third record. So, but still finding a way to make it creatively engaging and interesting, so people, first and foremost ourselves, don't feel it as a come down from this record.
Right. Which, so far from what I'm hearing, sounds like that will be a challenge. You guys are setting the bar high this time around. Given the length of time between those albums, one, I can look back and it looks like you guys really probably were feeling a good sense of momentum after A Dream in Static, and you were touring with some big names. It's certainly in the world of in the progosphere, as I like to call it. And with now 8 years later, I don't know. To me, what I see and feel suggests, interestingly enough, despite the years, you guys have really not lost momentum. Matter of fact, it seems like people have actually been anticipating. It's almost like you've been like this quiet cult kind of band that all the prognoggins out there were really into. And now it's like there's this chatter. And, there's a friend of mine who just discovered you guys recently. And he comments back in the group chat, it was hit him like hearing Images and Words by Dream Theater for the first time. Like, I haven't heard him get that excited about something in a while. And another friend, as soon as the tickets announced on sale, it's not a message to the group, hey, Caligula's Horse and Earthside tickets on sale. It's Earthside tickets on sale. Like, you guys are getting attention in that group as almost the headliner. And then I have already seen some online reactions, at least one of them talking about the title track, Let the Truth Speak, as like one of his choices so far for Song of the Year. So I'm curious what you guys are perceiving on your end and what it feels like to be getting this kind of feedback.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a relief because I think there was a real feeling. I know when we were at those moments of being most stuck with this record, with Let the Truth Speak, I definitely had some existential feelings of my life is passing me by. Our lives are passing us by. We missed the boat. We missed the opportunity. We had all this momentum. People are going to forget us, or they're going to kind of move on from us. And I think there has been some of that. So those feelings aren't completely invalid, or, you saying that while reassuring hasn't, I still know, if I'm being honest with myself, like, yeah, but we missed some opportunities there. That being said, I think when we released the song Let the Truth Speak, especially, and I think it helps that Daniel Tompkins was on that song, because a lot of the fans we had made from the Dream in Static album were Tesseract fans that really liked the song A Dream in Static, or Sky Harbor fans that really liked other Dan projects, So that really fell in love with the song A Dream in Static. And I think some of them, because that was their one song of connection, they may have been a bit more dormant. But because our song To Reawaken Them had Dan on it, that helped sort of re-engage them quickly. So I think that was part of it. And also, I still think there's more of them to engage, because our timing, and we're like 95% with this. Whenever we release a song with a guest vocalist, like almost guaranteed that band has an album coming out at the same time. So So like when we went to release the song Let the Truth Speak, Tesseract was on the verge of releasing an album and announcing their game and then their subsequent tour. So Dan's actually barely gotten even post about his collaboration with us still, because of what Tesseract's had going on. So and on the Dream in Static album, the three named vocalists were Dan, Lejean, and Bjorn. The album came out fall of 2015. Guess what? Soilwork, Seven Dust, and Tesseract all released albums in fall of 2015. And we had recorded these vocalists in the couple years leading up to it. So it was just total coincidence that it worked out that way.
Yeah.
But it did. So actually releasing the single with AJ from Fire from the Gods, it's the first time we've released a song with a vocalist where his band didn't have an album coming out at the same time. So we finally have broken our bad reputation for doing that. And even when we came back with All We Knew and Ever Loved, with Board Kolstad from Leprous on drums, Leprous was coming out with Aphelion basically at the same time. So again, it was another, not even a vocalist. It's a guest where we just timed it so perfect. You'd almost think we were doing it intentionally, but it's the exact opposite of what we would want to do. It's like, yeah, let's ride each of these artists' coattails of like, oh, people are going to be buzzing about their new album. Let's strategically, piggyback on that. But it definitely actually, works. Generally, I think works against us because then those people are promotionally engaged in promoting their own projects. So, yeah.
It's nice when things work out like that once in a while, right? Yeah.
It's about time we finally have it. Yeah.
Yeah. Can't always be snake bit.
Damn it.
It's interesting to think about. Like, you guys, I mean, I don't know any of your ages, but you are clearly, to my eye, young. And certainly 8 years ago, you were even younger. And just I'm impressed with a band with one and now a second album soon under their belt, with the pull of to get that kind of talent involved in their music. And it's like, wow, how did you guys pull these heavyweights into what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, and this album I think was different from the first a little bit in the sense that, with the Dream and Static, we really had no reputation and no history. So it was, cold emailing these people and emailing their managers. And, for every one we've gotten, there are strikeouts people don't know about. And so, but yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is also these people, while they get emailed a lot about certain things, I think it's becoming more and more the case that now people do reach out about collaborations. But when A Dream and Static was being created, 10 years ago, features in rock and metal really weren't the norm. It was much more of a hip hop thing, electronic music thing. So, there weren't that many bands probably contacting these people asking them to feature on songs.
Yeah.
And then on this newer record, Dan, we already had the relationship with from A Dream and Static, and so the only sort of name vocalist that we didn't have a pre-existing relationship with, who was on this record from the rock and metal world, was AJ from Fire from the Gods. Gennady is a name in the world music world and sort of in the Got Talent circuit. Larry Bragg is a name in the funk and soul worlds. But yeah, I think I would say on Let the Truth Speak, we were less riding the coattails of people's names and more now we get to feel like, because we were able to kick the door open, we now feel like we get to elevate talent and sort of bring people's, attention and use our visibility to get ears on people like Ketra, like Pritam, and so it's a good feeling to feel like we're now paying it forward in that way. On A Dream and Static, I think with Dan, he had a SoundCloud account that was just his individual SoundCloud account, and we just sent him a message with our own SoundCloud link to a demo of the song A Dream and Static, and that's how that happened. And with Bjorn, we were working with the same Swedish production team. They were in the studio with Jens, and we were working with David Castillo and Jens. So there was Jens Bogren. So, with Lejean, I had been Facebook friends with one of the guitarists of Seven Dust, John Connolly, for a long time. And when I sent John a direct message on Facebook at the time, he just gave me Lejean's email. So
that's so cool.
And again, I think now with it being a different era, and this was all now a decade ago more. So I think with features now being more prevalent, for a couple of years there was that site Featured X. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but there was a site where you could hire rock and metal sort of vocalists and solo artists for guest features. I don't think the site exists anymore, but a lot of prominent rock and metal people were on that. So I do think now it's people are more thinking to ask people. So we kind of got out ahead of it. We were messaging people when it was a more unique thing to do that. And now I would think it's a more saturated thing where you'd be competing against more people trying to get in touch with people to feature on stuff. So luckily, I think we're becoming less and less dependent on the notoriety and visibility of the featured guests, and still very dependent on, potentially more and more dependent on, having a variety of featured guests. But I think we're trying to make those relationships happen more and more organically. And through making this record, we have relationships with people also who didn't end up on this record, but we've kind of flagged as people for future and have begun conversations with.
Nice.
So, not saying that there's a song for them in mind, but there's at least, if we have that right song, or if we do have that direction in future, we have a well of people coming out of that Facebook post I alluded to earlier, that we have a pretty good well of vocalists whose talents we admire, and that we, at least with some of them, have some baseline relationship with at this point.
Very cool. Yeah, I just looking through the list of people on this album, and I just was amazed, really, in many ways, of the variety. When you guys call it an international affair, you're not kidding. Like, you're all over the place, and that is just, to me, really very cool. And it's also, and we'll circle back to this because I'm about to put a label on you guys. When we start talking about progressive rock, progressive metal, the prog world, and recent conversations, just the whole idea that there's so much of this interconnecting tissue among the bands and artists, where there's all these collaborations going on. Like in the 70s, I always saw it as one person was always leaving this band to go to another band, and somebody else left that band to go to this band, and it always seemed like people were fighting and then just joining up with others. These days, it seems like there's just this big group of collaborative people just hanging out and doing stuff. Hey, let's go do something now. Let's go do something else. And you guys are doing that and reaching outside of the typical circles that you might see. Like Daniel fits in. Okay, yeah, he's very much in that kind of proggy world, but Lejeanne is not, or Ketera is not, as I understand, although I don't know her well yet. Had to Google the name, I'll admit. AJ is not, and so I to me, the more those circles expand, I think the better it is for, music as a whole, but the genre in particular.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about Dan being from that progressive world, one of the things we felt this time, I think more so than on the first album, is if we were going to work with Dan again, one, we wanted it to be very different from the song "A Dream in Static," but two, we wanted it to feel even more clearly different from anything you could hear him doing in Tesseract from a musical standpoint. So I think, between having those orchestral strings elements in the song "Let the Truth Speak" that were not present on the song "A Dream in Static," generally are not part of Tesseract sound, and then also adding in Gennadi's vocals, it was an opportunity to create a very different sound world and context for Dan's voice to live in. Than in his other projects, and also from when we worked with him the first time. And I think it was definitely an active, an intentional choice to largely reach outside of the progressive music world for our collaborations, and to the extent that they're in the world, again, have it really be meaningfully different from what they've done in their own projects. If we just have like a regular prog song and we get a prog vocalist who's in a similar sounding prog band, it's like, all right, well, they could just do that in their own band. So I think in terms of creating some sort of new experience, both creatively for ourselves, creatively for them, and for the listener, generally pulling from outside that world or within the world in a very different way from how they're used in their own band, I think it's more inspiring for everyone involved.
Yeah, I love that cross-pollination, because to me that's honestly what it means to be progressive in my mind, is stretching those boundaries and pulling outside of the comfort zone. So the fact that they're willing to do that and you're willing to do that is kind of makes everybody a bit progressive.
And I think when you talk about the word progressive, I think something that we really, really focus on a lot is we think about progressive as an adjective more than as a genre, because I think at this point, and I think it's been this way for a while, our view is there's almost two separate genres. There's prog, which are bands that sound inspired by other prog bands that have the prog sound. So like bands where you think their musical ancestors are Yes, Rush, King Crimson, Pink Floyd, newer Dream Theater. So, and I think there are other bands that are more progressive in that they don't necessarily feel like they're inspired primarily by the sound of those bands so much as they have the modern day equivalent of the ethos of those bands of combining all these different influences from rock and non-rock genres of their era. And so we feel like we're more the latter of those two, that we're, for the most part, our biggest influences aren't necessarily classic prog bands. They're a mix of world music here, film score here, new metal and alt metal there, so new metal kids with classical backgrounds and funk and jazz, and you combine all that, and it's like, okay, that creates a progressive sound rather than our favorite bands are, and then you just list all the famous prog bands. And I think there are modern prog bands where it does feel more like they're the next, that they were clearly influenced by their prog ancestors, and they're not necessarily as progressive so much as they're of the prog sound. And I think those are two different things. And I think they result, what the sound you get from a result process wise, or how that inspiration influence works, I feel like you can really hear the difference as far as when a band is prog by virtue of their biggest influences all being prog bands, and so therefore you have this prog sound, versus a band where most of their biggest influences are not from the prog genre, but when you combine them, it creates a progressive sound.
Right. It's a cool way of defining it. Actually, I've heard that people talk about the differentiation between progressive and prog. You're the first one I've heard define it so clearly, at least. So it's very handy to have that definition now. I will put that in my brain. So
I don't know if it's formal. It's just, it's how we think of it. It's how my bandmates think of it too. So.
It works. You're the first one I've heard come up with it. So it's credited to you now at this point in time. You were the footnote in the bottom there.
Perfect.
So, you kind of answered one of the questions I was in my mind, is that, I go online, look at you guys and look up Earthside, and you see these classifications of progressive metal and post rock and cinematic rock, all of which I think match pretty accurately in one way or another. So what I hear is that for you, it's we're not so hip to the labels, and that your background, not as you shared here and as you shared with me in setting this up, would include some things that people might be surprised to hear about, such as new metal, and some of that more prog adjacent stuff, and you mentioned the funk and all that. So I'm kind of curious what you think fans would be surprised to hear you've been listening to.
Me personally, or my bandmates?
You, them, all of you.
Well, so, I think Frank has some really surprising, roots as far as, from his keyboard playing standpoint. I think he would say he's more influenced by like the beats of gangster rap than he is by prog keyboardists. Like for instance, like a gangster rap group like 3-6 Mafia, with some ignorant lyrics. But like the music can be pretty epic. There's a lot of orchestral elements, very intense, aggressive bass and low end. And so sonically, I think there's more that we take from that in some cases than we do from some of the bigger prog names. Frank also is really into, new age music like Yanni. I don't know if this is that surprising, but like more trip hoppy artists like Bjork and Massive Attack and Portishead, I think, that's kind of a mood and atmosphere that I think we become more and more attracted to.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, the new metal stuff. I mean, I think there's a lot of progressive bands probably have a soft spot for new metal if they're in our age bracket. I think a lot of the more quote unquote gent bands have a new metal soft spot. And I mean, I think that music has surprisingly aged well. I think it was very cool, then it was very uncool, and now it's kind of come around to be cool again. So
that's when you know you're getting old.
Yeah, when the music that right after its heyday was like completely the thing to hate on is now come around and now has been redeemed in the eyes of the new generation. So.
Indeed. Everybody's got those soft spots. Everything. Hey, I grew up a huge Rush fan. That was always for me, the band. And I took a lot of crap for it because they were not pop. So they weren't popular. They weren't classic rock. So the classic rock heads would dump on them.
Mm-hmm.
And then next thing you know, oh, look, for what it's worth, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Oh, look, I Love You, Man is a movie. Oh, look.
Yeah, I was just going to say that if you didn't.
They're one of the biggest bands ever at this point in time, and they are revered. And I can finally go, see, my life was not wasted. I was right all along.
See, I'm not old enough to remember an era where people would have given crap for being a Rush fan. As far like from the moment, I emerged from the womb, it was cool to like Rush. So
good for you. You missed a dark time, my friend. Yeah, those were dark ages. So part of your duties, I think, with the band, you've been described, I know you're guitar, some keyboards, some vocals, but you've been named as the band's orchestrator, which I take it to mean, of course, the one who handles orchestral arrangements and things like that, if I'm not mistaken. Shoot, which one was it? A Dream? No?
Mob Mentality?
There we go. Mob Mentality was your work. I blanked on the title all of a sudden. All I could think was Lejeune. I'm like, okay, that's not the title, Dave. So I'm curious, how does that impact your approach to composing when you're doing it with the intent that this is going to be part of a very heavy kind of rock song?
I mean, it depends on the song. Like, for example, when Mob Mentality was unique in that song was really built around the orchestra.
Right.
I mean, that the start of that one was my senior thesis for college, my sort of my composition project, and my professors really wanted to make sure that if I was going to do something with rock and metal, that I didn't make the orchestra sort of playing second fiddle for, I guess, no pun intended, because violins and fiddles are very different when you talk about this genre. But I think the orchestra was really front and center in Mob Mentality, where the rock band almost, was subservient to the orchestra in some ways. With the orchestral songs on the Let the Truth Speak album, it's, with the Dream and Static album, the orchestra was almost like solely almost on Mob Mentality, and then the rest of the album was pretty minimal in its orchestration. There's a little bit on Contemplation of the Beautiful. Entering the Light was more of a film score song, but the rest of the record, I don't think even had hardly a drop of orchestra at all. On Let the Truth Speak, well over half the record has some sort of either orchestral instrumentation or some other type of instrumentation. Like, the Lesser Evil has the horns instrumentation, sort of the funk band. So with the horn section. So when you add that in, well over half the Let the Truth Speak record has something beyond extra rock band, outside of the sort of rock band instrumentation, to add to sort of the sonic palette. As far as your question, trying to get back to it, as far as, how the conception goes as a composer, I mean, it's really hard to say, because it really is different from song to song. Like the song Let the Truth Speak, we wrote so much of that instrumentally before we even played around with the idea of, what about playing around with strings on that, So, and I think, this between adding strings and adding Gennadi's improvised vocals to it, the song just became a whole different animal. And I'm so glad we did, because I think that gave the song a certain gravitas and worldliness, that it, and just overall ethos and mood that it would not have had without those decisions. So yeah, I feel like I'm answering a very general question very generally. So if you have a more specific question, I could probably answer it more specifically, but just partly because there's each song,
right,
when there's an orchestral element to it, it's a different process and a different story of how it got there.
Yeah. And then that makes sense, that the genesis of the song is going to dictate a lot of how it's done. It fascinates me to think, like there's people out there that are composing orchestral music, a lot of them for soundtracks these days. And then, of course, there's people making rock and metal music. And I picture those processes being a bit different, and yet probably in their root largely the same. But at the same time, I guess I wonder, it's like, is that really a challenge to figure out, okay, I've got this nice orchestral arrangement, but now I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to layer the guitar and the bass and all that without screwing up this orchestral arrangement I put together, or whether it all just grew organically together in many ways, and everything is just another part of the orchestra.
Yeah, I mean, when I did, during the pandemic, I did a workshop through NYU. It was supposed to be in person, but then the pandemic hit and ended up being over Zoom. So there was a workshop of music for film, and then scoring music for film, and then there was another workshop that was music for video games. And during the workshop of music for video games, the guest composer, I think his name's Tom Salta, he was involved with the Halo soundtracks. Now I just don't want to besmirch his reputation by getting it wrong. Let's see, it's Tom Salta. This is good podcasting. Me just making sure I have this right. Okay, yeah, I have this right. The Halo soundtracks is his bread and butter. So one of the things he said was, figure out who's in the band, and not like who the people are, but it's a figure of speech. More like when you set out to compose a soundtrack, what is the sort of box of instruments you have available to you? And I think in different cases, when that decision is sort of committed to, can either be at the very beginning, where it's like, I want to write a song with these instruments and see what I come up with, versus, okay, my bandmates and I jammed in a rehearsal, and with the parts that we created, the riff is there, the atmosphere is there, but there really isn't a lot of melodic content, or we have this one melody, but there's all this space for this counter melody. So, because half of Earthside songs, it's roughly half and half. About half are composed where we're just jamming in rehearsal, and just kind of what happens. One of us might have an initial idea, we build it around. Sometimes not even. Sometimes just we start playing, and one of us cues up a sound. Another one, I dial up a guitar patch on the Axe Effects, and our keyboardist, Frank, goes to some sound on his Yamaha synth or Roland synth, or Ben has a drum beat. But some of it can be just very spontaneous, and we just start going and seeing what happens. So when that's the case, anything that happens orchestrally or vocally is, comes after that initial writing process, because none of us are singing in that moment. None of us are scoring in an orchestra. We got an instrument in hand. We're writing the part we're going to be playing. And so it's when we're then listening to, sort of in the demoing phase and the pre-production phase, listening back to what we've created, what would elevate that sort of, bare bones nucleus we have so far, versus, some of our songs, Mob Mentality on the first album, on this, I'll Let the Truth Speak song that people, I guess, will have heard by the time this is aired, Tyranny, songs like Denial's REM, But What If We're Wrong. So none of those songs are released at the time of this podcast being recorded. But, those are all songs where they were conceived of by an individual person primarily. I guess all the songs I just named are my songs. And so therefore I'm working in Logic Pro, and just as easily as I have access to my guitar and can grab it and record it, probably even more easily I can dial up a violin patch and start scoring strings. Wow. So that process aspect of it just being one person and not having, coming out of a jam session, the orchestra kind of works its way into the process earlier when it starts off in the box as one person sort of conceiving of, kind of with hearing it in his head and just imagining what it's going to sound like ultimately. I mean, another one that is released, All We Knew and Ever Loved, that was Frank's Baby. And I mean, that song is so built around, well, not necessarily orchestra, but pipe organ, which is a sort of cinematic instrument in this case, and then the brass. So, he's working with and starting to write that. He's building it around a pipe organ, keyboard patch on his computer and a brass, software instrument. And we then went on to record those with real brass and real organ. But as far as his writing, those were two, really key ingredients very early on, writing the song around those. Whereas, with Let the Truth Speak, the song, I don't think at any part the song was written around the strings. Everything foundationally was already there from us having jammed on it in practice. That was one of those songs where we jammed on it in rehearsal as a sort of just bass guitar, drums, and keyboards jam, and then just so many more things ultimately were added to it to make it what it became.
Nice. Fascinating. And it does remind me that's at least one huge difference between a lot of rock music and a lot of orchestral music. I am pretty certain anybody that works in that field can fact check me on this. I'm betting most orchestral compositions don't come out of jams.
It's true. Yeah, I think.
I don't think they originate in improvisational get-togethers with the band.
Yeah, considering with an orchestra section, if you have like violin one is like, maybe 10, 12 people on violin one, I doubt all 12 of those people just thought at the same time, I'm going to play this melody, so just how the tradition and how it's performed, how coordinated every person's part has to be with an orchestral arrangement, especially when you have multiple people on the same part. It's just such a different process from, all right, we got a guitar part, a bass part, and a drum part, and we're just trying to kind of feed off each other organically in the moment and hope we're reading each other right. And, when we don't, we can fix it in the, pre-production or demo or just run it again. But it is totally different process-wise for sure.
Yeah, nice. And that leads me to two thoughts now. One being that if anybody anywhere wants to question whether or not orchestral music can easily lend itself to metal, go on YouTube and find the metal version of the Godzilla theme by Akira Ifukube. I think I pronounced that correctly. I'm curious if I remembered the name correctly because I didn't look that up just now. And my memory is spotty at best. But the original Godzilla March, there's a guy out there that does a metal version of that. That song was made to be metal.
Was the name you just gave the composer of the Godzilla soundtrack or the person who did the metal version? That's
the original composer, Akira Ifukube, I believe it is. Somebody somewhere will check me, I'm sure. We'll look for it in the comments.
I met a film composer named Akira. I don't think person did the Godzilla sontrak, but if they did,
probably not. I'm fairly certain he's deceased. Yeah.
Okay. I was gonna say if he did, he's really humble. He left that part out, or he just assumed I knew and was like, how do you not know I'm the guy who did Godzilla?
And the other thought I have is, so in my mind, then presenting your music live presents some challenges with all that orchestral arrangement and things like that, because I feel pretty certain you're not touring with an orchestra. Yeah. And it's a bit of an exaggeration for me to say it, but I know where you'll be playing in Philly, where I'll be seeing you. And that place is kind of, like you can have an orchestra or you can have an audience, but you can't have both.
and you add on top of that our guest vocalist model, where there's pretty much for every song a different vocalist. There's now there's a couple of repeats, either a couple people who sing on multiple songs on Let the Truth Speak, and then Dan, who sings on both albums. But yeah, our model does not lend itself perfectly to the touring in clubs model, between the number of people that would be required to perform it all live,
right,
and because the vocalists are all so different from each other, it would be very hard to find that one vocalist who would be able to represent more than a couple songs live vocally, to tour with a live vocalist. So both on the vocal front and the ensemble front, we are not necessarily ideally suited to have the everything is live in front of you experience on the club tour circuit. I think at some point we want to build to having that, really epic show, or a couple epic shows where we maybe do a one-off in New York City, or one show in LA, one in New York City, one in London, or maybe we perform it somewhere that's not as obvious as those, but with whether it's a full orchestra or at least a significant subset of orchestral instruments represented, multiple of the vocalists who've, maybe not all of them, but some, a cast of the vocalists who were, on the two records, and getting to have that really special live show experience that is kind of the ultimate version of how these records would be performed. And, in the meantime, finding ways to make our live show have that balance of having that live energy of what's happening in front of you, and what represents compositionally what you're hearing on the record, and does that faithfully. And I think for different members of the audience, for different people who come see us, what that ratio is, people will have different tastes on what they feel like would be the optimal iteration of an Earthside live show on the club circuit. So yeah, I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. I think we've definitely very actively made the decision to prioritize what makes the most interesting creative experience and the most interesting and sonically rich and diverse album. Therefore, at the expense of what is convenient for the live club club tour. And whether or not, when I talk about what would make our third record a more livable situation, one of the considerations I think is going to be when we go to write and record our third album is, hey, we want to do this in a way that's, I don't want to say easier to create, to replicate live, but is, you can replicate it live within our means, more readily, in a way that feels more for the person, for the concert goer, like they're getting a fully live experience in front of them. How important is that to us? But in what are we going to have to forego to do that? And then will people, there's going to be people who, there's so many bands you can see live where it's generally they are the band, and that it's the four of them, and then it's the four of them on stage, and it's awesome. But I think therefore maybe they have limitations of what they can do on record that we haven't given ourselves. So it's a question of, do we want to have a record where we make it more like something you can really just do verbatim live, or pretty darn close to it, or do we stick to, maybe in a different way, but the priority is whatever we can do creatively and whatever we feel inspired to do, we'll figure out how to deal with it live later. Not our problem right now. We're just going to do what makes the inspiring creative recording we want. And so very much on the first two albums, that's how we've operated. And whether we will continue to, it's too early to say, but it is definitely a thought.
Hey, for what it's worth, I've seen Rush perform Time Stand Still many times. Never once did I see Amy Mann on stage with him, but I heard her voice every time. So, you know,
did they
you try
have
to be true to what you recorded.
did they have video of her, or would it just be coming out of the speakers?
Usually there would be, her face would appear briefly on the big screen in back of them. So we get that. But
Oh, just like a photograph, or would you see her singing?
yeah, I think it was a video clip,
Okay.
as I recall. Yeah. So we got that. She at least did that. Why she
Right.
couldn't come along, I don't know. Too busy.
Might have had her own tour she was doing, might have
Right.
had her own life she was living. So
Damn it, Amy. Carve some time out for Rush, would you?
yeah.
So anyway.
And while you're at it, Neil, come back from the dead and get on stage because we need to do this right. Yeah.
Oh, right. Yes. Yes. Please. On the upside, I'll see Getty tomorrow night. So
Oh,
that'll
right
be
on.
fun. But hey, Jamie, it's been a blast chatting with you, man. I really dug getting into this, and I love hearing about the creative process and all that stuff going on with Earthside. And it's always cool for me to talk with the people behind the music that's coming out there. So I thank you very much for your time tonight. I really appreciate it. So
You're uniquely positioned to get to do it. So, I don't know, did we cross off all your curiosities in my rambling? And because it seems like, as you said, when you asked a question, I hit 3 or 4 in one of them.
Yeah.
But so did we turn over every stone you had?
I think you covered bases very well, sir.
Okay, good.
You did a great job there of that. We got, at least for me, I sometimes I forget to ask a few things. I'll think of them later. I'll email you or something.
Yeah, if you have any unsatiated curiosities, I'll be happy to come back and talk again. So
very cool. Be happy to have you back. So
and
the album comes out Friday, November 17th.
Yep.
I'm not quite sure exactly when I'll have this posted. It might be right before that or right after it. We'll see how the next couple of days go. And then the tour begins February 1st, actually, right here in Philadelphia.
I think there's one date before that, January 31st in DC.
Is there one before that? Oh, got it. I even checked your website ahead of time and I got it wrong.
I think there is a January 31st date in DC. That's a good thing. It means, anything that went wrong that first show, if it did, then you get to see us having, fixed the kinks on show number 2. So
excellent. Yep. You guys out with Caligula's Horse, who I think they've got an album out finally. You didn't have any of them on your
they released a new single a couple days ago and announced, I think, an album coming out January 26th. So their album comes out days before the tour starts.
Good timing on their part.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll see you both then. Thank you very much. Best wishes with the album. I hope it's as big as, at least as the last album. I'm sure, I get the feeling it's going to be bigger for you guys. I do feel that sense of momentum behind this. So I think you're going to do well. And I have a very strong suspicion it's going to be well received critically too. So good luck with that. Good luck with the tour and everything. I hope it's great.
Thank you, Dave. And we look forward to meeting you out there and replacing the audience with a full orchestra in Philly. You'll be the one in audience there.
There you go. Take care.
Have a good one.
Night. Hey, what a really cool and interesting dude Jamie is. I really enjoyed that conversation. It was really a good time. I love digging into his brain about what's been driving Earthside and what's been motivating them over these years as they've worked on this album, making it exactly what they want to be. Honestly, it's a testament, I think, to their dedication and their commitment to quality, that they put that much time and effort into it. And I know it wasn't all about their effort and work that stretched this out a bit, other extenuating circumstances. But I also think it's a testament to what they're doing, the fact that they can pull in all these outside performers, all this other talent to work on this music with them. I think it says a lot. So I want to thank you once again, Jamie, for your time in talking to me. I appreciate you sitting down with me. And I want to wish you and the rest of Earthside the best of luck with the album and with the tour. I honestly expect it's going to do really well for you at this point in time because I can feel the buzz that's out there. And I hope it turns out to be exactly that and exactly what you want to be. I wanted to justify all the work and effort you guys put into the album. So thank you once again for joining me. Best wishes to all of you. And hey, those of you watching, thank you for joining me with this episode. If you enjoy what I'm doing, please, I appreciate if you do the things with the like and the subscribe and the bell. And if you enjoy progressive rock and metal, or you want to get into it a little bit and investigate and see what it is, head to Live 365 and check out my channel, The Expanse. Everything progressive, from the classics to the modern and the mellow to the metal. got it all there all the time, 24/7. And finally, if you wouldn't mind following me on the social medias, the links and the names are down below. Check it all out. Would be awesome. We can chat, we can talk, you can find out some things, I can find out some things. And hey, drop some comments in the comments section below there. Tell me what you think. Maybe you had some other questions for Jamie. I bet he'd be happy to answer some of those. Dude's pretty open. So thank you once again for joining me on Bleeding Edge Interviews. This is Super Dave, signing off.